In the wake of episode Ardyn, public opinion has turned against the Astrals. Personally, I believe that such an attitude undercuts the thematic resonance of Final Fantasy XV proper. As such, I would like to suggest an alternate interpretation. The Astrals are simply a modern take on the classical mythic concept of gods as embodied forces of nature. Let's start with Titan. Titan is the embodiment of the earth, an element that passively benefits humanity most of the time. Titan reflects this aspect of his element by catching and holding the meteor that threatened the planet of Eos, thereby converting said meteor from an instrument of destruction to a source of life. His associated natural disaster is the earthquake, which may be unpredictable and terrifying, but is neither common nor likely to pose a threat to an entire human civilization. Titan, much like his element, endangers Noctis when roused from his slumber, but concedes gracefully once his challenge has been met. Rama's characterization may be limited, but his few appearances show him to be an even more benevolent influence than Titan. In fact, within the context of gameplay, no other Astral is more likely to assist in any given situation. Given that he embodies electricity, an element that provides a vital service for modern humanity, this seems like a natural characterization. His associated natural disaster is the thunderstorm, which, while frightening, rarely causes widespread damage on its own. After all, while thunderstorms are often accompanied by high winds in reality, such winds are presented by the game as the domain of the messenger Garuda rather than Rama. Of all the embodied forces of nature, the sea poses the gravest threat to human life. Leviathan's element is one that is simultaneously critical for human flourishing and liable to wash away entire cities without remorse. In fact, her associated natural disaster, the tidal wave, is known to do exactly that. This, I believe, is why she does not face the same sort of censure from the other Astrals as Ifrit when she threatens to wipe out Altissia. Annihilating a civilization without warning is something the sea just does. It is interesting to note, however, that it's impossible to know whether the other Astrals would have been forced to respond had Leviathan's defeat at Noctis' hands not been preordained. Shiva's association with ice and snow is particularly interesting given the way her role changes over time. Ice storms and blizzards are the only natural disasters that have historically served to bar humans from existing within an entire region. Without a comfortable command of fire, consistently frigid environments are simply antithetical to human life. Furthermore, even in more moderate regions, unseasonably cold weather can devastate an entire society if it kills the crops people need to survive the winter. In other words, widespread famine may be the natural result of Shiva's element operating as intended. As such, Shiva's initially hostile attitude towards humanity is only natural, and, likewise, it makes perfect sense that Ifrit's fire and technology should serve as the catalyst that thawed the Glacian's frozen heart. Humans wielding fire can develop civilizations even in the most frigid environments, and human technology can all but eliminate the threat of famine. Just as Shiva's element historically transformed from an object of terror to a display of natural beauty, Shiva herself changed from a heartless killer to the one Astral most invested in humanity. Ifrit, of course, is the only elemental Astral who is condemned for his actions towards humanity. If the Astrals are taken as personal beings, this might seem odd, given the similarly serious threats that Leviathan and Shiva have posed to humanity. Interpreting the Astrals as embodied forces of nature, however, lays the essence of his wrongdoing bare. Ifrit is the embodiment of fire, an element which is both dangerously indiscriminate when wild and capable of incredible good when controlled. His associated natural disaster is the wildfire, which burns fast and hot, but, when operating within its natural cycle, expends itself before causing irrecoverable damage. With this in mind, it's easy to see where Ifrit went awry. His aggression towards Solheim was not simply an unpredictable flare-up of the sort his element shares with Leviathan's. Rather, his association with humans pushed him towards a very human desire for vengeance, unbounded by his natural limitations, and in pursuit of that vengeance, he sought out allies to aid at the destruction of humanity. And, having thus set his will at odds with the character of the element he was meant to embody, Ifrit left the other Astrals no choice but to make war against him. Finally, we reach the one Astral who is not an embodied force of nature. Rather, Bahamut, as the god of war, is an embodiment of a social dynamic, which in some ways makes him even more interesting. Why does Bahamut have knowledge of the future that the other Astrals cannot possibly possess? Perhaps it is because he alone requires knowledge of the long-term relationships between humans to adjudicate his natural domain. War, after all, emerges from the dynamics of human societies rather than natural systems. And what would it mean for Bahamut to embody war anyway? One implication, presumably, is that Bahamut's associated disaster is the most dangerous by far. Shiva can render a region devoid of life, and Leviathan can drown a city, but Bahamut alone governs a power capable of destroying all of human civilization. This, I think, is why Bahamut's fatalism is a necessary element of his role. He is meant not just to eliminate the Star Scourge, but also to guide human conflict towards the ultimate good of humanity rather than its final destruction. But, because war is a force which a god of war can only mitigate rather than eliminate, human suffering is inevitable. Bahamut simply seeks to redirect that inevitable suffering by, on the one hand, allowing it to serve as judgment on corrupt civilizations, most obviously the Solheim and Niflheim empires, and, on the other, calling individuals to sacrifice their own well-being by bearing a larger share of that suffering for the greater good. With regards to these sacrificial individuals, much like the Astrals, we are provided with a contrast between one who accepts his role gracefully and one who is either unable or unwilling to accept what he has been called to do. Episode Ardyn and its prologue may evoke great sympathy for Ardyn, but it also portrays him as an incorrigible rebel. It's interesting to note that Ardyn insists on seeing himself in a messianic light in spite of his ultimate unwillingness to submit. While he sees the throne as a burden he must bear to save others, he insists on challenging his brother's right to that very throne. Even as he complains about being chosen as a sacrifice, both of the titles he references are inappropriately messianic ones. Though he attempts to appropriate the role of sacrificial lamb for himself, Ardyn is neither pure nor blameless, and he is certainly unwilling to accept a destiny that requires the surrender of his will. Rather, he serves as a failed scapegoat who, having taken the world's corruption upon himself, cannot bear the price that entails. Complicating matters further is the implication that Hera knew of Ardyn's fate and withheld that knowledge from him. Given that she knew him better than anybody, perhaps she understood that he could never truly accept a role that challenges his messianic self-conception, and that, in the end, may have been why he was chosen to be the limitless shadow that would usher in the light. His fall can be perfectly summed up by his insistence on saying, non serviam, even when faced with the prospect of suffering without reprieve. Noctis, in contrast, struggles mightily with the suffering he is called to bear, but he never truly rejects his calling. In the end, he is willing to pay whatever price is necessary to restore light to the world, even if that means accepting a very different role from the one he had been raised to expect. If anyone in Final Fantasy XV is a sacrificial lamb, it's Noctis, a truly innocent victim who surrendered his own will and was slain for the sake of others. Overall, then, the Astrals' role makes far more sense when they are judged not as powerful human-like beings with elemental powers, like the Greek gods, but as proper embodiments of the forces of nature and society that they represent. Ifrit and Shiva may have become more human by interacting with humanity, but that is not the natural state of the Astrals, and in Ifrit's case it led to his ultimate downfall. As a modern mythos, this portrayal is quite interesting. It draws more influence from the impersonal interpretation of nature taken for granted by us moderns than it does from pre-modern tales of unpredictable personal gods. Meanwhile, the behavior of Bahamut as an embodiment of human conflict draws upon the Christian concept of redemptive suffering, which in turn affects the way that Noctis and Ardyn are portrayed. While Episode Ardyn calls the Astrals' motives into question then, it does not definitively demonize them. In the end, the Astrals' position as impersonal embodiments of natural forces allows them to coexist comfortably with the main game's Christian thematic and symbolic concerns, as they remain mere servants of a higher order in which redemptive suffering is critical.